What is up, everybody? Today I'm here with the former coach of or esports, Vapen. He actually did some work for us at 100 Thieves as an assistant coach briefly last year. So that's when I got to get to know him a little bit in person. And and everyone I've spoken to only had great things to say about Erik, and I can confirm this having worked with you, Erik. It's really a joy having you with us at 100 Thieves, and it was cool seeing how you kind of work. So I'm sure we're going to get into some of the coaching discussion. But for those that aren't really familiar with you and your background, I'd love if you could give us just a quick rundown of you in esports and sort of where you're at, how you came to the position you're at now, which is now you've sort of stepped away. So and maybe a bit of an explanation behind that too.
Sure. Thanks for the awesome introduction. This is my first time on a podcast, so I've never really had one of those, but I appreciate it. And also thanks for the opportunity at 100 Thieves. I had a great time down there. Super solid org. You guys were more than hospitable. It was an awesome experience. So a little bit about myself. I've coached professionally for about 2 years now. I started with Cloud9. But before all that, I was a player in CS. I didn't make it to the tier 1 level, but I was IGLing for, 15 years in ESEA, and I made it up to Premier. But back then, in those days, there wasn't a lot of money in esports. So it was really hard to keep the dream going while you're in college and balancing, having a social life and all of those things. So I kind of was back and forth in and out of esports, and this. I'm sure everybody watching this understands that this is a huge hobby, huge time commitment, and sometimes when you step away, you find your way back in, right? So I was transitioned to kind of my professional life in coaching. Before that, I was working as a mortgage consultant. So I was helping people secure housing for, loans for housing, buying houses or refinancing. And the interest rate shot up. So I had an opportunity to jump into coaching with C9. I did that for 6 months. And then I transitioned over to OR Esports, where I was coaching in challengers, and then spent some time with you at 100 Thieves, and then back to OR, and then was recently kind of dropped late December, so right before the season started, which wasn't the greatest thing, but it is what it is. But yeah, that's kind of my background. Since then, I've stepped away from coaching professionally. I still play the game often. I'm pushing out YouTube content pretty much, 3-4 times a week. So I still love the game. I still have a passion for coaching, but for me, I'm in my early 30s. It's really hard for me to justify the amount of time that it takes to be a solid coach, and full-time coach with one individual team. That's a job that takes anywhere from 50 to 60 hours a week. And right now, with the scene where it is, the money's not really there for me. So I've decided to step away from coaching as a career. And more so focusing on pushing out content now as kind of a side hustle, but also to give back to the community. I know that good coaching is hard to come by, and a lot of it is paywalled. So really trying to push out content on YouTube to kind of, bridge the gap between tier 3 to tier 2 and tier 2 to tier 1, and even players of all skill levels. I think there's something to be learned from watching content. But yeah, that's pretty much what I'm doing now. Other than that, I just go to the gym and hang out with my dog, and yeah, that's pretty much it. What have you been up to?
Doing stuff like this to me.
Yeah.
I think in a similar spot to you, sort of also in a position of where there's an opportunity to reinvent oneself. That's like the most optimistic framing that you can have with it, but it's true as well.
Yeah.
And I think this is really any experience that people generally tend to have in an economy that's really shit, is that there's going to be less opportunities, that constriction, and no one is no one is not the correct word, I should say. Many people are not safe necessarily. There's not many positions that are like completely safe. So even if you are in a spot where you feel like pretty comfortable, it's intelligent to think about ways you can reinvent yourself. And obviously when things are going super well, maybe it is because, you did reinvent yourself at some point and things kind of got better for a while, but it always will be, be the case, I suppose, at some point that you'll be forced to sort of reinvent yourself, or have you be presented with that opportunity. And so that's kind of where I find myself. I know that's where you find yourself too. And it's cool to see, kind of pumping out the content for people. It's especially cool because, I think, generally coaches that are able to coach tier one teams aren't necessarily doing that. It's not really all that common that, I can't think really of many people that are doing it. Obviously, there are some projects here and there. I know Anders,
Sure.
for example, who has, worked as a strategic coach for Fnatic. He's throwing some stuff out there. Obviously, Sliggy, when he left coaching, he has his own sort of Patreon thing going with Mini, also from Fnatic. So there are definitely some people doing stuff here and there, but it does feel kind of few and far between. And on top of that, there is a lot more to coaching than just having like this very, I suppose, narrow view of, okay, here is strategically, like, this is like what makes sense. There's like a lot more to the picture. So and I think that's what a coach, like, let's say, or someone like yourself, you're going to have that bigger picture sort of in mind when you're making stuff, because you've had that experience with player development. So
definitely. I think that a lot of the scene, and this is not even just Valorant games or even life in general, people are really misguided in understanding what it takes to actually get better at something. So if we just use Valorant, for example, I mean, I know I have friends that play 600 games and act in ranked, right? And they might be playing, let's use Reyna, for example. An agent, if you have goals of, playing professionally, maybe playing Reyna is not optimal, right? But I even know players that play a ton of, like, let's say they're a Killjoy main and they play, I don't know, 250 games Killjoy ranked, but they still don't have anti-flood mollies on Ascent. You know what I mean? Like, there's so much... People put so much time and stock into playing ranked and just playing the game as the only means to get better, when in reality there's so many other things that you can do to just enhance the efficiency of your time, whether it's thinking about the macro, coming up with lineups, lineups that are easy to use, that aren't necessarily, you don't need to line up in a specific spot, or you're just understanding how to throw things on the fly, because a lot of time in the heat of the moment you're not able to get to a certain spot, or maybe something's smoked off or whatever, right? But like, really get good at the things that will separate you from the pack. And I think the pack right now, the mentality is just to play, But if you become a student of the game and you put more effort into lineups, VOD review, setting yourself up with a solid routine and being really systematic about the ways that you improve, even, stuff on your channel, like the aim training stuff, you know what I mean? I know a lot of people say like, oh, aim training is a myth, but it's BS, it's that's not the case, because any type of structure that you have that you commit to long term will make you better, will only make you better,
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think it's because you can also still put in the time to play, but it's about
absolutely.
how you sort of where you decide to focus and why, that actually becomes where you can make the real gains. And I think something you were as you were talking that came to my mind was you used the word like the flood mollies. And for me, I think something that's harder for someone that is a player that's learning, or just newer in general, is that there are so many different things going on. You're not going to be a master of the theory. You're not going to have all that stuff in your head. But this is, I think, what good coaching is all about, is creating a framework where you have the language to be able to categorize things and like kind of chunk them down into like smaller categories. So, and oftentimes when I try to explain things to people, I try to kind of go from that to that place. Like, for example, there's a while ago I think I was doing some looking at some VOD of Bang playing Omen, and he was on Haven, and I was just explaining just the support smoke that he used backside on A, and I was just saying how C, and I was just saying how, okay, as the anchor, you've got 3 decisions you can make, and these are the principles kind of connected to those decisions. And so I think when you think of it in those terms, suddenly it starts to get a lot clearer, I think, for players, when they can be like, oh, my objectives actually is to delay, and delay is like a principle that makes sense, because I harm the ability for my opponents to take space, so they have less options, and then my teammates have more time to rotate into better positions. So it's like, it just, being able to use the language in a way that's effective to direct people in terms of how they should learn, I think is really huge. Because again, like, if you just play, you don't spend any time doing that, it's very hard to kind of figure out where, like, how do you separate these, like, where do you draw the lines between these different principles?
It's crazy. And I think people, they focus too much on mechanics and, oh, did I hit my shot or did I not? You know what I mean? It's never a matter of, okay, did I make the right decision, or could I have done something different to make the round harder for my opponent and easier for me? I like to think, like, when it comes to coaching, especially with my content, I try to take more of a logical approach more than anything, because I think it simplifies it for me, and it simplifies it for the students too. It's something that at any skill level, can kind of agree on. You know what I mean? And so, like, just from a fundamental approach, it's super important to make the game harder for your opponent, easier for you, right? So how do you do that, right? You figure out ways to peek an enemy and make sure that there's more of your teammates on their screen when you're fighting them than there are on your screen when they're fighting you, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So how can you do that? You have these anti-flood mollies. So anti-flood mollies, for those who don't understand, mollies that you would throw on choke points on a certain map. Let's use Ascent, for example, for all the Valorant players. You throw one in the switch door, right? One that lands in the Omen smoke there, and then you throw one for Heaven, so that it isolates the enemy player that's playing on site. Nobody can run in to support them, right? So you have 4 or 5 people coming out A main, fighting against one person. Now you're only getting 5 seconds of support or anti-flood with those mollies as they go off, but you're making your life way easier. You're making the life of your duelist easier, and you're being more supportive, right? And I think that's kind of the big problem, is there's not enough people that take the supportive mindset when it comes to playing this game, and especially when it comes to the utility, right? The util usage. So I think if you can just kind of approach things as, like, just from a logical standpoint, am I making the game easier for myself, or am I making the game harder for myself by doing what I'm doing, right? If you can make the game easier for yourself by learning lineups and making, like, watching VODs, having set aim routines, you know what I mean? The other thing too is, with ranked, is you actually get diminishing returns the more you play. Everybody knows the mental aspect of it. I mean, you lose 3 games in a row and you're in shambles, and then you don't start communicating, and yeah. Anyways, so figuring out a solid pathway to success is really hard for people. They don't know where to start. So that's kind of what I'm trying to bring with my content, is just trying to get people on track, and looking at the game in a different light, because I think the mechanics and hitting shots are always going to be the sexy thing, right? Because you see the clips on Twitter and on YouTube and Jarso this, all that, right? But in reality, there's a million different ways that you can impact the round in a positive way, and they all don't have to do with mechanics.
Yeah, and I think one thing I can tack onto that, which I think also applies to aim training and pretty much anything else, is the sense of zooming out even a little bit more. That flooding is essentially something I would describe it as like a game state, and you can kind of categorize like lots of different things that are happening in the game as like these game states, because they're repeating. Like we only have there's only so many objectives in the game. Get the bomb down, eliminate your opponents, and retake the site. Like there's only so many game states that can be in operation, and it kind of all coincides also with how much time is left in the round, how many players there are, and these different types of things. And so that you see these repeating patterns. So the more that you yourself as a player sort of start to notice these things, the more value you can get from the kind of tweaks you can make in your decision making, to kind of better exploit these and optimize how you play in these different moments. Like in ranked, for example, it's really interesting, because you go into ranked and you play the immortal lobbies, and the amount of players that don't really understand how, let's say, just the macro works behind, let's say, a stuffed push. Let's say you try to hit B or something, and you get delayed on Ascent, you get delayed. It's like there's only so many things an opponent can do in that position on the attacking side. They can either cut noise, re-hit the site, or they can reset into mid, or they can go all the way back to A. Like there's only so many things you can do.
Yeah.
But it feels like most players don't understand their options, and then also the options of the opponents in that timing. But that is a very repeat. Like those players have probably been in that situation hundreds of times, yet they still don't get it. So that is interesting, and I think it does come down again to just this inability to kind of think about not just what is the game state, but then being able to, by that notion, be able to then sort of optimize the options. And the reason I brought aim training into this as well is because this is exactly why coaches are really helpful, because you might be able to understand roughly, okay, well, this is the game state, but it's going to be the coach that will be able to help you better understand, because they understand all the principles that tie into everything. They can like a coach should be, in theory, really good at looking at a snapshot and being able to just understand everything that's kind of going on, and then being able to kind of direct you into the optimization quite quickly, as opposed to you just sort of not knowing all the elements, not having that experience, and then making like having to go through lots of trial and error. They should help you shortcut based on their understanding of the fundamentals. And so in aim training, the issue is similar in that a lot of people might be like, okay, so I understand that I have an issue with flicking. They may not quite understand where all of the leaks are, but they kind of roughly can say, okay, this is the category of the area that I need to kind of look at. And then when they actually get into the training, this is where it's difficult because they don't understand all the fundamentals behind, well, how should I improve it? Like, what should I be focusing on? So a lot of players they'll just grind the flicking, like certain flicking tasks, and they won't really know how they should be focusing their attention when they're doing the task, like what actually needs to be optimized. Because if you don't do that, and this is, I think, one of the key differences, if you don't do that, you're just going to reinforce likely habits that you already had. And
usually
that's what
bad
a habit
habits,
is.
right?
Yeah. So you got to be
I
really
mean,
intentional.
I'm even victim of this for aim training. I've had little spurts where I do it for 2-3 weeks at a time, and then I give it up. And a lot of it is just because I'm misguided, right? And there's a lot of free resources out there for you guys on YouTube, right? Even myself, I should be looking at this. But like when I don't really know how to get better at like I've been doing the Elige playlist that Matty OW put together, right?
Yeah.
I don't really know how to get better at, or if I'm gripping my mouse the right way, or if I'm gripping it too tightly, or why I'm over flicking, am I positioned correctly, abs to the desk, like all these things are super important, right? And I don't really know. So it's interesting that you bring that up. I mean, even people with 15, like myself, 15 to 20 years of experience playing games, video games, FPS games, there's still things that I don't know about aim training, right? So it's interesting to always, be able to continue to learn. And honestly, I'm gonna look into some of the more of the aim training content because I think it is important.
You just raised like a really interesting point actually, because what you just mentioned, like, oh, I don't know if it's this or this or this, and I think that's like, I think everyone that's played, like, try to compete at any levels will probably be familiar with this feeling of like, yeah, should I change is my sensitivity the wrong sensitivity? What crosshair is like the best player using this week? And
exactly.
you don't know where to direct this energy. The energy of, I feel like I need to do something different, but I just don't know what it is. And then you end up focusing on maybe the wrong things. Because, for example, you actually mentioned a few things that, when I've spoken to Matty in the podcast, it's like grip doesn't actually really matter too much. Like you can find any amount of like really, really sick aimers on any amount of different like ridiculous grips. Grip is actually not important. There's like so many things that are not important, but you can't know that. You can't know that yet. The coaches will know that, but you can't. So that's like where the interesting difference can be. And that applies into Valorant. I think that goes really nicely into the Valorant examples we were using, where good coaching can be really, really crucial. And if the coach really knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's another thing too, is like that's obviously super, super important at lower skill levels, right? You need to figure out what you're doing wrong, and you need to understand the lingo, and everybody's going to have a different, like, for example, if I did private coaching with somebody that's, plat is going to have a different routine than somebody that's a Radiant player. You know what I mean? There's different things to focus on, and that just goes without saying, so I might actually tell a player that's plat or silver or whatever I might just say, turn your brain off and literally just run around and play Reyna. Like it pains me to say that on an internal level as a coach, but if the mechanics aren't there, then go do it. You know what I mean? Like just play unrated and just run it down. But maybe a Radiant level player isn't understanding the macro or understanding when they need to take, go poke for info as duelists in the round because it feels really weird, or maybe they've taken a site and they haven't gotten any kills, and they understand that they have limited utility for the counter to counter the enemy's retake. Maybe they need to poke a little bit further and get a little bit more proactive, right? Things of that nature might apply more to a high skill player. But I actually think, like, I'm just going to pivot here. I'm just going to kind of run with this idea, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
But I think, like, at a tier 1 level, like, I actually think the most important thing for a coach to be able to do, outside of like building a culture and getting everybody to buy in, and this is going to sound kind of backwards, but it's like, figure out a way to make your job as a coach easier than it actually is. And what I mean by that, and I'll elaborate, is figure out ways to make the players take ownership in what they're doing, right? Like, get them to buy into something that they've put work into, because I feel like a lot of the times when players are spoon-fed ideas and strats, it's not, there's not a 100% buy-in all the time, right? And people just are, naturally they want to do things that they were a part of creating. You know what I mean? So as a coach, if you can kind of build this culture and set teams up for success by assigning, at least at the start, assigning them to bring certain strats or pistols or defaults, or have the IGL talk about how they view the macro of the map, make sure that everybody's on the same page, and really build towards a place where a coach can barely get a word in server time. Those are the teams that I think are like taking it to the next level. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense because I think there's
Yeah.
also this almost unconscious, or can be. It depends because some players, like some people, everyone has like there's like a level, like a character stat sheet in an RPG of agency, and some
Yeah.
people are more
Yeah.
like higher agency than others, and some people will be like, my will to achieve what I want is so much that I don't give a fuck what anyone else is doing. I'm going to put
Yeah.
in all this effort. But there are,
Exactly.
I think most human beings are going to kind of be more adaptive in the effort that they're putting in, and so that if there are a coaching staff that are doing lots of really great stuff, and it could be really great individuals. It can have, this is the danger that, yeah, they can start to rely on the coaches, and that actually
Yeah.
creates a problem because now they're too disconnected from their effort and the
Yeah.
outcomes, and they're just more kind of expectant that the work will be done for them, and that now you've got, yeah. And this is the interesting thing about tier 2 teams, right? Isn't it? Because if you look
Yeah.
at the tier 2 teams, they're so hungry and they have less resources. The players are like kind of forced into this world where they do, like, the teams that succeed, they're going to have players that are actually going crazy
Oh,
and going high
absolutely.
agency. That's like, look at the best tier 2 teams right now, they are all like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other thing too is like, um, if you have one player on the team that is doing more than the others, I mean, generally it'll be the IGL, but let's say you have two players that are putting in a lot of work and you have three that aren't, that are more reliant on the coaching staff. There's going to be some type of natural, just weird feeling amongst the players, right? You want everybody to commit the same amount, have the same vision, the same dedication to winning, and put in the same amount of time and work, right? It's the most annoying thing in the world when you have one player that just continuously misses lineup. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
just little things like that, and then all the four other players thinking, "What the fuck is this guy doing? Why can't he learn this?" Right? But I always like to think about it, and I go back when I was a player. Coaches weren't even really a thing back then. Everybody was self-taught because there wasn't a lot of money in esports at the time. Everybody was self-taught. So I like to think like coaching can definitely be valuable for those that need it, but I honestly believe that there's a lot of resources out there for people if they look in the right places that can help them become more self-sufficient learners. You know what I mean? It really, at the end of the day, just like anything in life, comes down to how bad you want it on an individual level. If you set yourself up with a solid routine and you commit to it, you can do anything. You know what I mean? I know it sounds cliche, but you should never be super reliant on other people to kind of bring you to the next level. You should be relying on them helping you set up like a nice routine and a nice baseline to get started at. But really, it comes down to how bad you want on an individual level, in my opinion. And I think that one other thing that oftentimes gets overshadowed is like there are people out there that are still playing this game on like 120 hertz that have really insane PCs that have not been optimized. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it is, you gain such an advantage from having, obviously there's a financial barrier to that, and that's tough, but I would say then like there's free content on YouTube on, some people don't even know what XMP is, you know what I mean, in their bios they don't have it on. There's tons of things that you can do to boost the performance of your PC, and I don't really mean to take this whole tangent, but like you're going into battle against people that have PCs that run better. You know what I mean? It's not really a fair fight all the time. So that's another thing that I see a lot too with players when I do individual coaching. I'll ask them what kind of gear they have, and usually it's not super super optimal, and it sucks that it's paywalled and there's a barrier, but it's just kind of what it is.
Yes. Yes. It's interesting because I remember when I was again, it's kind of a different era, but when I was a younger player, like especially in the early days of PC gaming, like the equipment was kind of it's very hard to
Oh
get like something that
God.
could the hardware was behind, let's just say that. So you really like needed a really sick system or like a very
Yeah.
expensive system to like really have like the best FPS. So that meant that by that notion almost no one had that, so everyone was like kind of obsessed with optimizations, and so it was like hard not to run into that. But these days, obviously, like a game like Valorant, like, you know, you can only change so many settings. You can open the console and like, you know, try, you know, 100 different like console variables that could optimize things, you know, here and there. Obviously there is still some level of that in Counter-Strike,
Mhm.
or actually a pretty decent level of that in Counter-Strike, because the console is available to be used, and you know that's just how the game still kind of works. But Valorant's not like that, and we've got a newer generation of people that aren't like, they just get a PC, and it's like you can get like a PC now for like, you know, $800, $1,000, and it's probably
Sure.
going to run the game like really well, especially if it's optimized like you say. So
Yeah.
it's a different time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yes, it is interesting. So speaking of you know, coaching, you know, we recently had
Mhm.
that drama with Woohoojin, and I just to
Yeah.
recap that for people, just the summary if you weren't, if you didn't see that. It's not like a super huge thing, but I think it's interesting. You know, Woohoojin is probably one of the biggest, maybe the biggest content creator that kind of is coaching the casual audience, to try to
Sure.
get, you know, the casual players who want to go from, you know, maybe it's as low as bronze all the way up to radiant potentially, and sort of the whole kind of pitch is that, you know, I'm a radiant player, I know how radiant players think, and so, you know, I can make all this content and tell you how to think like a radiant player and get you up there basically, and get you the rank that you're looking for, and so and it was discovered that he had never really achieved radiant. He was actually kind of had a boosted account. Essentially, someone did the detective work. I saw that, which is
Yeah.
quite
Yeah.
interesting. And so now
Tracker
he's
GG. Tracker
yeah,
GG.
tracker
Never
GG,
lies.
man. So that's the drama, and so essentially, you know, selling his services on something that wasn't real, being a radiant player, actually not a radiant player. So what's your sort of whole take on all of this? And I'm also not entirely sure if there is like a much bigger web of content creators of this type in the Valorant scene, but he's got to
Sure
be
there is.
definitely one of the biggest, if not the
Well,
biggest.
yeah, yeah, I'm sure he's one of the biggest. I think one thing with just the online landscape is it's very easy to lie about things, but it's also very easy to get caught if somebody does the digging, right?
Yeah.
Um, right, because you're not dealing with people face to face a ton. So I would say this: I think that no matter what the situation, if you're lying about your status or what you've achieved, it's probably like I don't really respect that. Um, especially if you're making a ton of money off of it, right? But the other side of the coin is like I'm sure a lot of I don't look at his channel. I've never really seen his stuff. I know I've seen like the banana on Twitch, like, but I've never really watched any of the videos. But I think like there's still useful content that he's pushed out. I'm sure he's helped a ton of people, right? And who knows how boosted he is. And to be completely honest, I think people that are like in high immortal, immortal 2, immortal 3, basically think like radiant players. They just don't have the individual skill. You know, they think like radiants, but they're maybe missing a couple elements. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I probably shouldn't give like a professional opinion on it because I haven't really seen it. But yeah, I don't know. I think whenever you kind of misguide people and into paying for your service by saying you're something that you're not, it's probably not a good thing. But
That's called fraud.
yeah, yeah, there we go. Yeah, the F word. But yeah, I think like I'm sure that he's put out good content and he's helped a
Yeah.
lot of people. You know, like I don't know how boosted he is. He's probably like Immortal 2, Immortal 3-ish, if I had to guess, right? Like even I was Radiant in beta, but like now I'm Immortal 3, Immortal 2, but I still like I said, like Immortal 2, Immortal 3, anywhere in Immortal, you're kind of thinking like Radiance in a sense. The difference is really not that big, you know? So I don't know. I'm sure he's helped a lot of people with his content. I'm sure there's people that will vouch for him. Um, and yeah, I don't know. What do you think about it?
Um, yeah, I think really it's always very unfortunate when, you know, someone's misrepresenting themselves, and because I don't, you know, I don't care about it, but as soon as you're obviously defrauding people for money, because you're selling against that reputation effectively, and trying to leverage that to get the sales. And so it's kind of hard to say, because did that tip a lot of people over the edge and actually paying for the service? Probably. I would say probably that's quite likely. So yeah, that's immoral, that's unethical, and that's not considered legal. So, and that's for those reasons, because you're cheating people out of their money effectively. So that really sucks that happened. And but I agree with you. I'm sure he and I have seen a lot of his content over the last year or so, doing more content myself. I try to like look at a lot of the other creators, and he's definitely got a lot of good content and stuff that's like formalized like fairly well for players. And obviously he's not trying to say that he's a tier 1 coach or anything. Obviously he would never be able to prove that, because that's a bit harder to kind of fake that. So in this case, he's just trying to help people in the casual players. So it just sucks that it is this way. I'm curious what his comeback will look like, because he's created a business out of this, so I'd imagine he would want to salvage this. Kind of curious how that's going to go. I think I saw that his approach is that he's not going to he's like taking all of his coaching offline for now, and he's going to like hit Radiant first, and then put the coaching back on. So he's got to hit Radiant first.
Hey,
so we'll see.
Good for him, man. He's got to earn it now.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I hope that he does more to try to make it up to his community. But we'll see, because apparently, I saw on the Reddits, a lot of people were starting to ask some questions like, hang on, how is he sort of struggling in some of these Ascendant lobbies and like these kinds of things.
Well, that's one thing that's interesting too. Like, so I was Radiant in beta, and I don't know, maybe up until like episode 3 or 4, and then I took the job over at C9. And just naturally, because of coaching, you're putting so many hours into not playing the game, just watching. And let me tell you, watching the game, way more draining than playing it ever will be. Okay? Like, I don't know, like sitting here 8 hours watching, a couple hours for VOD review or setting up lineups, coming up with strats, 5 hours of scrims, another hour of VOD review afterwards. It is super, super draining, and you don't really feel like playing the game after that. You know what I mean? So he's definitely got some catching up to do, because even when I came back, like, I didn't get Radiant right away. Like, it took me a while to play again, you know what I mean, and really catch up, because you think about how much time people are putting in, especially these younger kids that they finish school and boom, straight to rank, right? It's not really the case for people that are coaching, especially someone like him who's putting, I don't know how many lessons he's doing it per day, but I'd imagine anywhere from 6 to 8, probably, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know that he does a lot of streaming as well as the content, so I'm not sure what balance he hits. But yeah, I totally agree with you. It's very hard to balance that. It does feel like you do need to grind very hard to get Radiant, and kind of almost no matter who you are, unless you are like one of the, actually a legit pro. So that's kind of
I'm trying to get it. I'm trying to get it again this act, just for fun, just to prove that I can do it.
Yeah.
We're getting there. I think I'm Immortal 2 or 200 RR or something like that right now, but we'll get there. It's hard solo queuing though. It's hard.
Oh yeah.
That is not fun.
I kind of enjoy it more sometimes, just because it's you just have to have the right mindset with it. Like, you need to really understand. It's a good place to really practice this acceptance. Firstly, like, just accepting all of these are all the tools you have to work with, essentially. Some of the tools are going to be worse than other tools, and some of the situations will be worse than other tools. But you have to really learn how to accept the reality, and then sort of repeatedly get into the mindset of like, how do we always describe, just stay in problem solving mode constantly. And as soon as you're getting emotional, it's usually a sign that you're not actually doing that. Because if your brain is instead focused on like, okay, the equation has changed, so my math here needs to change, and the output's going to be, or rather the answer is different, so I've got to just go with that, and that's cool.
Yeah.
Eventually, you like you were saying earlier, it can, things can start to get to you a little bit, and at that point you're probably getting worse quality practice, and you're kind of coming out of that mode of problem solving. So
absolutely. And honestly, in ranked, some problems literally cannot be solved.
Yeah.
Like you just can't solve them, right? And like ranked is definitely not, well, it's a depiction of your skill. It's not like a completely accurate representation of it. You know what I mean? It's like there's so many things that could go wrong. You could get 3 teammates with no mic. You could get a teammate who goes AFK. You know what I mean? You have a controller that doesn't know how to throw smokes,
Yeah.
whatever, right? A Sova who doesn't use utility. Like it's just I don't know. So that's why I get a little ticked off when I see people playing 20 games a day and then just driving themselves deeper and deeper into this hole, and then they get depressed about it. And there's so many other better ways to get better at the game that don't really involve ranked. But I say that, with a grain of salt because it is important to play. It is definitely important to play, but it's all about balancing it out.
Yeah, and I think what you said there too. Like some situations you can't win. I mean, these are situations where a lot of people do get sort of frustrated and throw all the toys out the pram. And those sports are interesting because I think people, it becomes about like how do you orient your like what is your objective for playing this particular ranked game? Because winning is nice, but winning shouldn't be the primary objective. And this is where I think people get really this is what fucks them up the most, I think, because the objective, if you're in a game where you can't win, well, it doesn't matter too much if winning isn't your primary objective. If your primary objective is getting better as a player, which is going to let's say across 100 games is going to get you more wins in the long term. Well, I mean, that's kind of like a better path for the objective of winning anyway. But then also it takes into account that, well, the game is kind of complex and I will lose some games, but how can I extract the maximum amount of value from every game I'm playing? And so if you're in a losing game, you can focus on specific types of plays or skills, or you can come away from that game with certain questions that need to be answered, whether it's playing a certain position better or having to come up with new ideas or asking yourself the question if what you were doing was correct or not. Like being able to stay in that place of constantly refining things is going to help make you better. But if you come away from that because you got emotional and you're like, oh, I wanted to win and like I got frustrated at my teammates, you're not getting any of that value.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you just can't be a results-based gamer. And what I mean by that is like the way that you feel about getting better cannot just be solely represented by winning and losing. You know what I mean? Everybody needs to have a goal when they go into playing ranked, like you said. So I completely agree. I think that's at the end of the day, that's really the biggest problem with, the masses that play this game in ranked is they are kind of misguided. There's no general goal for today in ranked. Like, okay, I'm not going to overpeak in any man up situations, right? People are more focused on hitting shots than they are making a good decision. And sometimes a good decision is not taking a fight, by the way, prioritizing your life is probably, in my opinion, the biggest difference between tier 2 and tier 1. Maybe like top tier 2 players do this, but there's a lot of teams in tier 2 that don't really do this, is just really, really prioritizing your life in man up situations. And having this kind of switch in your head, this is especially important for duelist players and for CS people that are entry players, is understand your goal in the round and what your job is. Okay, on attack side, it might be to dash into sight and take space, clear certain angles, and get a kill. Once that job is finished and you've completed your task, flip the switch, and now your job is, okay, I'm not a duelist anymore. I am focusing on being tradable. I want to break the dart that's coming in. I want to make sure that I'm communicating and setting my team up in post plant, or telling someone to play off of me, or whatever the case may be. You know what I mean? That, I think, is the difference between tier 2 and tier 1. Is you see it all the time in these top level games, like man up situations. People will immediately disengage from playing in a bad spot. You know what I mean? Like there's no hesitation. It's just second nature. Where sometimes a tier 2 or a tier 3 player they'd put more emphasis on going for more, or but I had a good peak. This was a good peak. No, it really wasn't. So I think that's kind of something that's important to talk about or to think about, especially if you're a player that wants to make it to tier 1 that's kind of struggling in that tier 3 to tier 2 space.
Yeah, I think this is probably a great question, actually, for people that are of that mind. Like you're saying, having really good fundamentals is pretty key, and as you're highlighting, it's something that can really easily get missed, especially by players that have quite a bit of mechanical kind of talent. They can kind of get away with a lot. So, do you have, if you were to list out some of the fundamentals that are sort of like must have these fundamentals, what would those be for people?
I think like one really important rule to consider as a player, and this is not really just for duelists, but just in general, is like, can you figure out a way to get the first kill with your brain and the second kill with your aim. You know what I mean? So what I mean by that is like limit the amount of 50-50 fights that you're taking as your first engagement. Try to kill people when they're running into sites, when they have to look at a multitude of angles versus just looking at you on the on angle, right? And then your second kill, if you're getting pressured, your job is to kind of stay alive as long as you can, and then have a skillful fight, where they know exactly where you're at. So I think does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's one fundamental piece. I think another one is like, at the end of the day, can we figure out ways to, and I alluded to this earlier, figure out ways to have multiple people on your enemy's screen when you're fighting them versus just, solo fighting them, or you fighting two people at once. Go ahead and call your 3-2-1s, um, especially when you're in a man advantage situation, right? And then I think really the most important thing is kind of understanding, and this one's more complex. It's not really, can't really put like a fundamental on it, rule to it, but try to get good at understanding when the win condition in the round is in your favor, and then naturally just realize that you need to take less risk when that happens. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Risk is not worth it when you have the win condition in your favor.
Like a 5v3 on defense.
Like a 5v3 on defense, or a 5v3 even in post plan. Don't stop peeking these angles that make no sense, right? Like, prioritize trades. Make the game harder for the enemy, right? Never make it easier for them. That should be like the fundamental goal of any game. How can I make this game easier for me and harder for my opponent? You know? And yeah, I think when you start thinking like that, you can kind of come to certain conclusions, and you're able to evaluate yourself in VOD review and think like, oh, okay, did I really do a good job of making the round harder for my opponent here? Or was this a bad peak because even though it's a good angle for me per se, maybe it's just a bad fight because of the way, like, you have to think about the round as a story, right? And you have to react. Your play should always be dynamic and be a reflection of what the story is telling you. You know what I mean? So I think that's something to consider. And it, honestly, a lot of the times in scrims too, even in ranked, is like, you guys could call something and the strat could be going great, and then like having that internal voice in your head that says, okay, we actually don't need to do this anymore. Like, we can just chill out and like make sure that we're regrouping and we're practicing good fundamentals, we're scaling in together, all of those things, prioritizing trades, you know what I mean? So being able to realize when things are unnecessary and that the risk just doesn't make sense to take, I think that's what really makes good players take that step.
This kind of reminds me actually of something I often say. It's like how I look at, I think, competitive anything at the top level, when you're like almost assessing teams as well. So this is kind of an easy way to assess some teams, and where you draw that split between tier 1 and tier 2 type of thing, where if you have tier 1 teams playing each other, in theory, if you're going to, this is one way I would group them, is I would have all my tier 1 teams have excellent fundamentals to the degree that they'll always execute. If they're in a situation like you just described, like, like the 5v3 or whatever, like, they're not going to ever make that mistake where they're going to give away the edge. It's a maybe 90%, 90% of the time they're going to win from that advantage. They're going to win from that advantage 90% of the time. Whereas, if you have a team that doesn't understand the fundamentals and make some mistakes here and there, sometimes that's not going to be, a victory when it should be. And so the mistakes are just going to come to you as the other team against that team that's not got great fundamentals. But again, the tier 1 teams have great fundamentals. So you can no longer just try to outplay them on fundamentals. You have to instead, I think you described this earlier, you've actually repeated this quite a few times, about making the game harder for the opponent. But against really good teams, you actually have to force them into discomfort. You have to force them into having spots that are really hard to make decisions. So then you're creating your own openings that you can then exploit, because they're not going to just come to you. So if you're the better team, if you are the tier 1 team and you're playing it against, in theory, the tier 2 team, you actually can just kind of chill, and you can just play the fundamentals, let them come to you, because they're going to bring the mistakes to you. They're going to kind of tie the noose around their own neck and sort of, hang themselves, should it be the case that you're able to just play the better fundamentals. You don't have to do anything special. And that's how you can really tell. Exactly. That's how you get the best games. You've got two teams that are very disruptive, and it's very hard to predict. Those are the best tier 1. Those are the best versions of the tier 1 games.
Absolutely. I think another thing to consider that's important is like, so let's just take this 5v3 example that you brought up, right? Like the snowball effect, okay, or the domino effect. if you're in a 5v3 and one of your players makes a bad decision and goes and dies, the next person is more likely to try to, kind of like equalize the situation. And by equalizing that, I mean like go for a trade kill, or do you take some type of risk that still doesn't make sense because you're still technically in an advantage, right? And then you see, like, once you see these forced plays, you'll just see domino, domino, domino. They all fall one after the other, right? And so if you can just make sure that you're not the first person. If everybody kind of commits to this identity of, okay, in 5v3s we're playing, exclusively for info. We want to stay alive, prioritize our lives. We're jump spotting on extremities. We're not taking 50-50 fights, all of these things. If we can all commit to those and do a good job of those, sure, there's going to be that random occurrence where, Aspas swings you and hits you on a jump spot, you know what I mean, and headshots you. Like, okay, that's unlucky. But now we still believe in our 4v3 retake. We're good to go. You know what I mean? But you have to have this cohesive, almost conversation with your team before the games even start, before the practicing even starts in the off season. I think is where conversations like this are super important, and it's kind of a cultural thing where people are just like, it's second nature now. Like, everything is understood. These are the laws that we live by as a team, and we're going to live and we're going to die by them. Sometimes we're going to die by them, but we're going to live by them 99% of the time, and we're okay forfeiting that 1% in return, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it makes complete sense. And
Yeah.
it's, speaking of kind of being in those teams and systems, and I think one of the things that you kind of mentioned, which I think was like a really cool way to help people to think, is by, if you can kind of like see like the outcome, you can kind of maybe extrapolate what is the path to get to that outcome. And so, one thing I think that's overall kind of, coming in here is that, like, to even be on a team like you just described, like you need to have good fundamentals, because regardless as to how talented you are, it's like, yeah, if you can hit lots of great shots and clutch and all these different things, like if you're like looking at trying to join like a serious team with, like, some really good players, kind of real recognize real in this sense, like good players will understand who they want to play with. They want to play with people they can rely on, and if the whole team is able to have good fundamentals from the get-go, and that shouldn't really be something that you have to, like, it shouldn't be the case that if you're getting to like a higher level team, that team's going to teach you fundamentals. No, like if you haven't gotten it down by yourself at that point, that's not going to be on them to help you with that. So their job is to help you fit into the system of that team, which goes beyond that. So you got to so I think what we've been highlighting here is like, there are some really important things that people need to be focusing on that they don't necessarily like really probably think about it as much as they should. And this is probably where good coaching comes in. And maybe we can plug you more as a coach here, because I feel like you're right. You're one of the ideal people, if because there are we talked about Woohoojin earlier, and there are these two different audiences. There are the legit aspiring pros, and then there are the people that just want to get better. And if you're a legit aspiring pro, like booking some time with Erik here, it's going to definitely be worth your money, because again, like, knowing what it takes to fit into a team, and being able, as we kind of set up earlier as well, able to have someone that knows what they're talking about, be able to point out like these critical things that you need to fix, that you can't easily, like, if you haven't been in that team, you can't necessarily know that. So having someone like Erik here is, I think, invaluable to kind of fast track your way into higher tier systems. And I think this is kind of a good segue to Erik, because I do want to talk about you were essentially like a GM as well as a coach, so you were kind of in charge of having to have this 360-degree picture of, I've got to build a team, and so that therefore requires, I need to understand like what in-game leader I want. I need to understand what kinds of players are on the market, so I have to be able to think about players. I have to be able to think about talent scouting and player development and team culture, and then also building a playbook around the players that I have, and then trying to in a season, like, scouting and seeing who's available, how do I slot. There's so much complexity to all of this, and you kind of have to do all of that by yourself with OR Esports. So
it was interesting, that's for sure. But I feel like I gained a lot from it, just on a personal level, and the things that I'll be able to take way outside of the game as well. But yeah, I was coaching, did not have an assistant coach, did not have a manager, so I was booking the scrims. I was responsible for kind of picking the roster that I wanted, although there was, the org definitely had some say as well, especially when changes wanted to be made. That's more when they came in, but they trusted me with replacements, more so than anything. Um, and I have a good understanding of the scene itself and the players in it, regardless of what tier 2 or tier 1, or even tier 3 sometimes, just because of like how much I played ranked earlier on before I was a player. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but I actually was like potentially going to get a tryout with C9 as their IGL like back in beta. So like I was playing actively more so on the West servers than Central at the time. But all of these players that were coming up, can't really think of it now, but like even players on my team like Nilyaz, like I was playing against Nilly and ranked all the time, and he was shitting on me, but like I know who's good at the game, and obviously on Twitter you see all these clips and whatnot, so I had a good understanding of what the talent was out there. And I think for me, like the coaching and the GM aspect of it was more so about managing personalities more than anything. And what I mean by that is like I think the big thing that I'm a massive hater of, in the gaming community is cope. I think
Yeah.
there's way too much cope going around. And for the people that don't know that, it's just just like using something as an excuse when there's it's clearly not actually the only thing that went wrong in the round. You know what I mean? Perfect example is like, oh, but I had a good peak here, but you're in a 5v3. You know what I mean? So like you're coping your way out of making. You're basically not taking ownership of the fact that you made a bad play by saying that it's a good one, right? So I always looked for players that took ownership in their mistakes, were willing to call each other out for it. Is the second thing, because I think another thing that's kind of backwards in the scene sometimes is that the coach's opinion isn't always the one that matters most. I think sometimes just naturally as humans, when we hear things from our peers, they stick more with us. So building a team and setting up a culture where, the players are keeping each other accountable, right? Oh, you don't know this lineup? Why the fuck don't you know this lineup? Like, what are you doing? Do you need me to send it to you? Like, I've had players say that to other players before. And then it's my job to kind of reel them back in and make sure, like, all right, boys, we're still on the same team. We have the same goal in mind, and kind of diffuse situations that might arise. But I think it's important to kind of build that culture. But yeah, other than that, I mean, the GMing thing was fine. I mean, could I have used some help? Sure. But like booking scrims is not difficult for me. I know what teams I want to play against. I want to play against tier 1 teams or tier 2 teams. That's pretty much it. And honestly, play against GC teams. I love scrimming teams because the one thing that you'll notice as a player is like the tier 2 scene is kind of, there's two different tiers. There's a tier of tier 2 teams. Sorry for using the word tier so much. There's a class of tier 2 teams that will just disrespect every piece of skill that's thrown in front of them, right? So you can't really practice what you're trying to achieve, right? And honestly, OR Esports was guilty of this at a certain point as well, right? Where we kind of had to dial it back and like, okay, let's play a little bit more fundamental here, right? But there's teams that do that will disrespect your util that you throw at them. It's really hard for you to find some type of value in practice, right? And then there's teams that play the right way, right? And the right way is really how you would play it in a match. So I always think that people naturally tense up in matches, and your job as a coach and as a team to figure out ways to scrim the way that you would play the scrim the way that you would play it in the, you know what I mean? And I always felt like GC teams were like the best practice outside of like the tier 1 teams because they just respected the util they played it like a match. You know what I mean? Like there was no people like triple like scrimming through a smoke, or you know what I mean? Like doing things that they wouldn't do in a match, if that makes sense. So I'm definitely very thankful for all the GC teams that we played in practice, because that honestly we got a lot of value playing the scrims.
Yeah, I remember the similar sort of feeling watching the scrims with 100 Thieves, and
Yeah.
we'd end up scrimming some of the GC teams too, and they're always like great to play against for
Sure.
that reason. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like managing there's a lot of like potential questions here around all of this, because I think it's something that's is like kind of harder to envisage if you're not on the team end. Is all of these different tiny kind of issues, like not playing the scrim like a match? When is that appropriate or not? Because there are times when obviously that could be appropriate, depending on what you're trying to achieve as a team. But the issue, I think, comes when the practice is not intentional enough. And that tends to be, I think, the issue. Because I think one of the hardest, or at least one of the dilemmas I think many teams might go through, especially in Valorant, actually, especially in Valorant, is you don't really get this opportunity to kind of feel like you're in a match until you're in a match. Like it's hard to kind of practice like you're in a match. And so when you get to the match, it's about, we want to execute on the practice and how we play in practice, and if we're disciplined and consistent in our scrims, and you still can't feel like a match exactly. So, and because unlike Counter-Strike teams who go to events all the time, they're able to get lots of tournament reps. That can be kind of like a challenging thing, because when you get to the day of, and we had this definitely on 100 Thieves like last year, where we get to the match, it's like, okay, lots of things are happening suddenly that just aren't happening in practice. So how do you solve that? That's a horrible question, and everyone hates to see that. If you're sat in the back room and you're like looking at stuff and it's like, okay, this is not like how we practiced it. That's I feel like a scary sentence to say or to realize.
Yeah, it is. But I think the one thing to remember with that is, like, you can only control your own team. You can't always control your scrim partner, So that's why there's a lot of blacklisting of teams, and players don't want to play other teams sometimes. And really, all you want to do is try to find 5 to 10 solid scrim partners, and then you kind of run with it. But I totally agree. Like, getting the actual match reps is hard. It's so hard. But the only way that you can really combat that, I think, is if you kind of establish this culture where, like, your practice is intentional, like you said. Every day you're intentional. Certain days you might just straight up say, like, okay, we're playing, this is literally match day. Kind of have this pseudo match day where coach isn't talking, we're calling timeouts, and I might mark down, like, oh, you're taking this fight doesn't make sense to me, this is not something that you would do in a match. You know what I mean? And being able to be honest and transparent with your players, I think, is super, super important, right? There's been many times where I've told my players, like, you're not doing this in the match, bro. Like, why are you doing it in a scrim, right? And these are the important conversations, I think, that coaches and players, and honestly players to players too, need to be having with each other.
It's
to be intentional.
It's interesting, because in matches, you introduce the element of pressure, which is just the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Now the mental game is becoming a factor, and it's not really a factor in the scrims, because there isn't the pressure. It can't exist. So that then you really find out what sort of some of the players are made of, in a sense, and like who has kind of like what type of mental game leak. But even that in of itself, I think, is something that is harder to really understand just by watching, because you don't necessarily, like, you can see what the outcome is. Okay, the player missed a shot, and sometimes like missing a shot can just be missing a shot, and sometimes missing a shot's actually a mental game leak, because that for whatever reason, like, because you don't know what that inner experience of that player is that moment, and it could be as opposed to a mechanical lapse, it could be that they got into their head, they're getting into their head a little bit for some reason or other. And it's, again, like, that's a whole big area of itself. And again, like, that's, if you're not getting a lot of match reps, that can be another thing where it's like, oh, it's quite frustrating, because that's hard to kind of deal with. And in Valorant, you don't get many matches to play compared to some of the other esports, so that can also be quite the challenge. And having the right personalities on the team is a really good way, I think, or like the stuff you're talking about, having a good culture on the team. It's a pretty good way to actually mitigate some of those problems, because the players will be less likely to get into bad places if the whole team itself is got good chemistry, and people are kind of they just like gel well together in that sense, and people are getting what they need from the team, from a positive emotional perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I think, like, uplifting your teammates, especially if it's like a whiff or something like that, I think that's super, super important. You know what I mean? Some players are able to bounce back on their own, but other players are not. So, having a team that they have solid EQ, they just understand, they can read the room, you know what I mean? And they know how to talk to each other and say the right things in the right moments, is super important. But the flip side of that is, during practice, you need to be able to say whatever you need to say, and understand that everybody has a common goal, and that's to get better in, you know what I mean? So there's a time and place for everything. And, like, if there's one time and place that I'll allow cope, I think it's in the match. I'll allow it in the match, because sometimes it's Hope hits quick and it gets you right back to where you need to be. You know what I mean? But in practice, it really kills progression.
Yeah, yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. It's pretty interesting how much like these kind of tools can help, even if it's, let's say, like that's probably like you know, in the long term, that's, I feel like the cope is definitely a net loss in the long term,
Mhm.
but there are
Yeah. Oh
definitely
yeah.
instances where it can, as you say, like it can just keep things at bay, compartmentalize things
Oh,
a little bit,
absolutely.
and then keep
Yeah.
everybody on track. And you know, this is a reason why you never, there are certain types of conversations you don't have on match day, right? Because it's like you can't fix anything on match day. Everyone's in execution mode, so you
Yep.
can't be tweaking shit right in this
No.
moment. So you got to like focus on the right things.
100%. I think cope is like you putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. You know what I mean? Like it'll help you for 5 minutes, but then it, you know, you still need to go to the doctor and fix that thing. So yeah, but definitely you can't be saying, yeah, you can't change fundamentally everything. Like, oh, like you can't peek anymore. You're not hitting your shots. Like no more peeking. Like no, you just have to play the way that you practice. You know, and you got to just hope for the best. Sometimes it's not your day, especially in Valorant. It's super complicated. There's so many variables that can go wrong. There's so many util combos. I think in this game more than anything, it's it's obviously skill dependent, but I think if you have a good ability to like read the information that's given to you at the start of the round by holding tab and looking at the ults and the monies. Oftentimes, if you're a good player with a lot of experience, you can put yourself in situations that are more favorable for you, where your mechanics or your actual skill, or you're less dependent on hitting your shot like all the time. You know what I mean? So
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. There's so many things you got to take into consideration when you're building a team, because I feel like when you're building a team, like it's you have to have all these things in your mind as to how well the play, because you can have like really, this is why, you know, any given super team probably won't work, just because you
too many
can't
egos.
just index for this for the skill on the
Yeah,
outside. You got to think about these intangibles, and these intangibles are like everything, and it's almost,
hmm
it's so frustrating in that way, because you can't, it's so hard to measure that, you know, it's very hard. I don't know
yeah,
if you can measure that. You have to kind of experience the because I mean, everyone's super complex as, like, you know, individuals, so how do you can't like math your way out of that. You got to just put it into practice and see kind of what happens.
yeah,
Sometimes go on your gut.
yeah. I think the hardest thing and the most unenjoyable thing for me as a coach was always the times where we're trialing new players. Not because I didn't enjoy seeing the new talent. It's just that I feel like no matter like you're always going to get the best version of them in the trial. Not
Yeah.
necessarily their play, but the way that they present themselves, the way that
Mm.
they handle being critiqued. They're going to, oh, let's try this idea, you know, this and that, and they'll have ideas and ways to counter things, and then oh, you sign the paper and maybe it's a little bit different. You never know. There's always going to be a little risk involved, right? So I always hated that because you never, just like job interviews, same thing. People show up with their suit and their tie and fresh new haircut and this and that, you know, but you never really know who you're getting until you get them, you know.
Yep.
So
With that said, you know, how do you like to, or what stands out most to you? Like when you're trying to find a player, I'm sure that, you know, of course you got to think about what kind of role that you need on the team, but outside of that, if we're talking more about the intangibles a little bit and not just the skill and all the raw skill and the role they might be playing, you know, what are other things that you feel really help you to kind of figure out who to pick?
yeah, I think for me it's always kind of been about finding the right mix of personalities, right? Because I want to, with my teams, I'm trying to create a brotherhood, but also people that enjoy being around each other. You know, we've all worked that job with the one coworker that just sucks, and you don't want to create that environment. Your goal as a coach is to create a solid environment, right? So first of all, you need to evaluate personalities. Do I think this group can work together? Um, you know, and I think that's super important. I also look at like how much they're playing the game outside of scrims, you know, and if they're not playing the game, are they, you know, watching VODs or whatever, or you know, and then also how, like, are they bringing ideas to practice? Do I really view them as a thinker? You know what I mean? Somebody that's thinking about the game actively. Like, are they a student of the game or are they just a player? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Things of that nature are more important to me than raw mechanical skill, because I think like the more stressful the situation gets, the more likely stuff like that can kind of go out the window sometimes.